going to look quickly at aquatic food production systems. So these are all the significant ideas from the IB Guide, so I would stop and take a look at them and actually read them. Application skills from the IB Guide and the knowledge and understanding from the IB Guide. So definitely read through them and make sure that you have this basic understanding. So when we're talking about marine ecosystems, first we're trying to discuss which zones we're actually addressing. So if we look, we're talking about the intertidal zone, which we already talked about. So that's the zone that is covered with water at the high tide, and then the water retreats at low tide. Okay, mangroves are describe an area where there's these large mangrove trees that have these very interesting roots that almost look like stilts that the trees are standing on. It's also a coastal zone. Estuaries, lagoons, and coral reefs also describe coastal zones, and then the deep ocean. So these are the zones that we're looking at, and if we look over here, I want you to notice a few things. A few terms you should know. So the top layer is the photic zone. Okay, the photic zone just means that's where photosynthesis can take place. Then after a certain depth, we get to the aphotic zone. So the aphotic zone means that no photosynthesis can take place there. The other thing I'll have you notice is that this along the seafloor is called the benthic zone. Right, so if we're looking at depth, a good amount of light can penetrate up to about 200 meters. And then after that, between 200 and about 1,000 meters, there's, like a medium amount of light. So it gets to a point where it's kind of like twilighty, even in the middle of the day. And then after that, after 1,000 meters, no light can penetrate. So then it's just dark all the time. Okay. And this impacts the way that food webs develop within the ocean as well, because most of the food webs we've talked about are supported by sunlight. So you're not going to be asked questions about those deep fat communities that can exist at the bottom of the ocean. Instead, we're expected to understand those food webs and those food chains that are dependent on sunlight as their primary source of energy. So things you should know. The continental shelf. So the continental shelf is just a side of the tectonic plate that extends under the ocean before it drops off and meets with the oceanic plate. So the oceanic plate is more dense, actually, and tends to drop down. There's a steep drop between the continental plate and then the oceanic plate. So this is where we get into that deep ocean. So the continental shelf is where most of the productivity occurs. So that's an area where light can penetrate, where algae, phytoplankton, sea plants, if you will, can exist, as well as the fact that there tends to be a little bit more nutrients there from upwelling. So upwelling just means stuff moving from down below up toward the surface, okay, which brings nutrients, as well as things like, the rivers and runoff from the land bring nutrients into that area of the sea as well. So a lot of the productivity occurs there. The deep ocean area actually has quite low productivity, and if you think about it, if there's no sunlight, then we're having trouble with producers. So the producers and food sources are things that probably have died and then sank to the bottom. So that's how we're getting energy to that area. So highest productivity is found near when you see these questions, please pause and give them a try. But this should be easy. You could say near the coast or near the continents. So how do we get the energy to make these aquatic food webs? So there's a heck of a phytoplankton in the sea. So that's our number one primary producer that we're talking about. Then the phytoplankton tend to be very, very small, and then they can be eaten by the zooplankton, which are tiny little animal-like creatures, so tiny little consumers, and both of these actually can be consumed by larger organisms as well. So these are the base of our food web. So we have our primary producers and then our primary consumers, typically within any food web. Okay, pause again. You should know this, okay? Next, practice on labeling. So pause and give it a shot. So we're starting with our primary producers, which are supposed to be our phytoplankton. Then we're here with our zooplankton. So pause and try and label. Okay, welcome back. So this should be our primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, quaternary consumer. Fisheries, so where are we getting the fish? 1, we can catch the wild fish in the sea, and 2, we can farm fish. That's called aquaculture. What you see in these images is essentially a fish farm. So the fish are put into these floating rings. There's a big net that extends down into the ocean. The depth really depends on the type of fish that you might have and the population. And then you put them in there when they're babies, you nourish them, you feed them, you grow them up, and then you harvest them. Okay, so just like other types of farming. So some facts that you should be aware of. It says that 90% of the fisheries occur in the oceans, so there's a lot of consumption of ocean fish, as well as there's big populations, and people want to target those big populations for profit as well. 70% of the world's fisheries are exploited. That means they're being fished or being used. The MEDCs, so those are the more economically developed countries, are increasing their intake of fish for health reasons, like omega-3s, and doctors are recommending it for heart health and other types of health, and that we cut back our red meat consumption like beef. So people are starting to consume more fish. And then farm fish are actually becoming extremely common, almost as common as the wild fish. Fishing methods. We've talked about some different fishing methods, so this lists a few more terms that you can add to the list. None of these are sustainable, so none of the things that we saw in that documentary were sustainable. The bottom trawling, the purse seine, and the long lining, and I think that documentary even showed quickly the cyanide spraying and the blast fishing. So those are very extreme methods of fishing, and they're not sustainable. Okay, they definitely are highly efficient. They can, well, in particular the three from the bottom trawling, the purse seine, and the long lining are extremely efficient in catching a huge population of fish, but they have their drawbacks, and they're definitely not sustainable ways of managing the populations in the sea. So some things to consider. We already talked about seafloor damage that can be caused from bottom trawling. We talked about bycatch. So you have an image of bycatch here. So you should know this. So bycatch is what we catch that we don't actually intend to be catching. So it's not the stuff we wanted. It just happens to be there because it was swimming out in that area. So give an example of bycatch. You should be able to do this, but the example from the previous one was the sea turtle that we caught with the other fish. Now, fish consumption and fish catch. So we said fish consumption is increasing, the human population is increasing, and so here we have some numbers going along with the millions of tons of fish that are produced or caught, and we have first our wild catch and then our farm fish. So you can see a drastic increase in the amount of wild catch, but then here we see, starting in the mid-90s, it's now just kind of fluctuating around 90 tons, so we seem to have hit some type of limit. And then farmed fish, which didn't really exist, even in the 1950s, is taken off, so we're really trying to make that work to meet some of our fish demands. Okay, pause, you should know this. Okay, so benefits of aquaculture. So one, the idea is that we are growing the fish. We could grow them in the area, maybe in the country where we would want to sell them. There are some things we can do to increase sustainability and to leave the wild populations on their own. Things that are good are we can use food scraps from other industries, like if you have cattle or pigs or poultry and you've got some things you don't necessarily want, we can use them as fish food. Okay, when we think about carnivorous fish, that might mean that if you go to the factory where those animals are slaughtered and there's some organs and stuff left behind that people don't typically use for consumption, that we could use them to make fish meal or fish food, and that would be more sustainable than catching smaller fish and then feeding them to our fish so that those fish have food. This is also an interesting example of China. So China is using carp and catfish within the rice paddies, and they obviously defecate, and that increases the amount of nutrients for the rice. So that's an interesting way of kind of combining those two things that are needed within one zone. So what are bad things? So if you just look at this way, the way that's set up, we have our like floating ring essentially. Then we have a giant net underneath it. There's a highly concentrated population of fish within that zone. So there's a few things that you should notice. Obviously, when they defecate, that goes into the water and it's just going to sink down through the net. So no one's cleaning it up. If the fish escape, then we could have trouble with invasive or non-native species within the area, so entering the food web, as well as just general things like this is our huge population in a contained area, so obviously we need to feed them. Okay. There's also more of a chance for them to get sick, so we might need to provide them with medicines, we might need to use them antibiotics, etc., to make sure that they're not having some sort of outbreak of fish disease within that zone, because then that would mean, if you are the fish farmer, then you are going to lose those profits if they get sick and die. So you have to consider what needs to happen to have a profit and to make this a profitable business for yourself. Governance. So the UN, the United Nations Convention of the Laws of the Sea, began in 1982. There's a lot of changes that have occurred within the past let's see, since like the 1940s. So in the past 100 years, less than 100 years, there are some huge changes that have occurred. And some of it has to do with the area of land that extends into the sea that countries can claim and how they can use it. So that's what I want to talk about today. So if we look at this, and I know that the numbers are in miles, so I'm going to try and help with the conversion here, and it is sea miles, so then we have to convert it. You think that sea miles or nautical miles are a little bit different than regular miles, but for our purposes it doesn't totally matter. So if you look at the first little zone, this first little zone, it says it's about 12 miles or like 20 kilometers, so 20 sea kilometers. This pretty much belongs to the country it's next to. So you can defend this territory. So if another country had their navy sailing in this area and showing acts of aggression, you could attack them. It would be considered like an act of war. Then following suit, I think around 1945, the United States, being quite a greedy country, decided they would claim up to 200 or 370 sea kilometers as their exclusive economic zone. So that meant that they kicked out the other countries and said, this is ours, we can fish here exclusively, and if you want to come in, then you've got to make some type of deal with us and obviously pay us money. And then if we want to mine here, let's say for petroleum, we can do that, and it's our right, and no one else has the right to that area. So this started with the United States in 1945 and then has become quite rampant around the world. So there was a big sea grab where people were claiming that zone as well. And we read that I think Canada decided to do it in the 1970s, so it took them a little bit longer to do that. So those are the two main zones. And then, some areas have claimed even more of the continental shelf, but not the sea itself. They can no longer claim the sea itself. Conflicts. So you can read through these. There have been a lot of conflicts just about people fishing in other people's zones because they want the exclusive rights to the fish there. So we're talking about the Cod Wars. So Cod Wars is between Britain and Iceland and where they're fishing and where they're getting the cod. The cod is the same type of fish we read about for Canada, but this is a popular fish. It's consumed extensively in certain areas. It's considered an economic fish. They sell it, they make profit off of it. But when we don't have these clear lines of who it belongs to, sometimes countries get into these disputes about how they're going to manage them, okay, and who really has the right to fish in certain waters. So you can read through these. You can look up more if you want, but this is the same type of thing that's happening in Canada when they decided to remove the other people. And some of the same things that we saw in the documentary as well. Super quick, we're looking at the tragedy of the commons. So remember, when resources tend to be shared, then they tend to be overexploited. And that's been a big problem. So I'm actually going to pause here, and then we're going to need to start another short video about the next section. So thank you for being patient.